You're watching the Sunbeam Alpine channel on YouTube, and here we are back in Oily Puddle's garage.
This video shows how to rebuild a roots engine at home with basic tools. The assumption is that you have measuring, reboring or regrinding carried out at a specialist machine shop, who will then return the parts to you for assembly. Even if you've never rebuilt an engine before, if you do what is shown in this video, you'll be able to do it successfully.
This video is a remix of one of the first videos we ever made more than 8 years ago, one of our most popular videos. And over the years, we've changed some of the settings we work to. The ones that we show in this video are highly successful. And if you'd like to receive the sequential instructions detailing how we do this rebuild, just feel free to email me at the address shown at the end of this video, and I'll send the PDF to you. Companies like Alpine Innovations and New Forest Gaskets have taken the lead in developing new ways of sealing the Alpine engine and preventing oil leaks. It's well worth looking into this type of gasket if you're doing an engine rebuild. We thoroughly recommend both. Before you start, prepare what you need and what you need to know. We make a disposable guide that can get dirty in the garage. We have all of the instructions written out in sequence, including all of the torque figures. When you're confident what you're going to do, start rebuilding.
The process is very similar whether you're building a 1592cc engine or a 1725.
The block is stripped bare and in an engine stand. It's been rebored, there are new cam bearings fitted.
Whether 1592 or 1725, this is how your block will probably be returned from the machine shop.
This is a 1725 5 bearing block. This is a 5 bearing crankshaft from a 1725 engine. When it comes back from the machine shop, they will have measured it, and if it's been necessary to grind any of the bearing journals, they will have ground them to a set size so that you can fit oversized bearing shells. Here I have 2 pistons, both of which are suitable for an Alpine. This one is an asymmetrical piston. You'll see it's got a groove down one side that it doesn't have on the other side. That must be fitted the right way round. That will have a label on it that says front. So you can see there that it says front to make sure you get the correct orientation when you put that into the engine. This is a symmetrical piston. It's exactly the same. Won't matter which way round you put that in. And both of them are suitable for the Alpine. But where you position the rings is critical. You can see on this old piston it's clearly marked front, and I've marked where the thrust face is with a red felt pen. This will be the side that you will see most of the wear on a piston. When that's on the conrod, that will be on the side that has the oil lubrication hole. Now it's very important that where you put the piston ring gaps in relation to where the thrust face is and where the gudgeon or wrist pin is correct. The new piston is warm, and I've just pushed the gudgeon pin straight through both piston and conrod, and now I'll secure it with the 2 circlips, one each side. Now you know the circlips are fully home when they're equally expanded and it's clear that they're properly seated in the groove. This one is, it's moving nicely, there's no free play. Now, looking at the conrod, you can see the oil hole there. That means that this side of the piston will be the thrust face. Now looking at this piston here, you can see that I've marked the thrust face on the top
with a red felt pen. Same side as the oil lubrication hole. When we fit the piston rings, we will do it in the following positions. You see I've marked where the gap for the top ring will be, where the gap for the second ring will be, and where the gaps for the two oil rings and the spacer that makes up the third part of the oil ring. This is how we will position the rings just before we put the pistons into the engine. Over time the rings may well move around, but when you first start and you're rebuilding, position the rings in this way. Your piston rings will probably arrive something like this, bagged separately. First ring, second ring, and the three-part oil ring. Sometimes they can be installed either way up, sometimes they are marked to show the top side. On this particular set, both the first and second ring are marked to show the top side and make sure you get them in the correct way up. Now once you've gapped each ring, it's important to put it on the piston and bag up that piston, keep it separate, ready for fitting. You need to gap to the bore and keep the right rings on the right piston. We gap the first ring to 13 thousandths of an inch. And here we have the top ring. We're going to make sure that gap is correct, 13 thou. You'll see if I push the feeler gauge into it, just tight, both sides, rubbing each side, nicely fitting. And this is the same all the way down. I've checked this ring already, and I know the bore is straight and the gap is correct and even. And the second ring to 15 thousandths of an inch. There's reasons for this. You can look at the research on the internet if you want, but it makes the engine seal better. This is the second ring, gapped at 15 thou. These are the three-part oil rings, and we will fit these to the piston first. When the scraper ring is in position, it's important that the ends are butting up against each other in the groove. They want to be like that, end on end. What you don't want is one over the other in any way at all. That will make the ring not work properly and could damage the bore. They must go end on end. You'll know when it's right because the ring will be fixed as three parts and will move easily in the groove. If you find yourself having trouble seeing when the rings are butting up correctly on this scraper, just mark it with a little bit of Tipex. It'll make it a lot easier when you look at it in the groove, and you'll see when you're butting end on end and when it's all fixed correctly. Now the oil control rings are much more flexible than the other two rings. I find it's easier to put the spacer part in to the groove first, put the lower part of the oil control ring below that around the main body of the piston, and then put the upper part on, and then as you bring the upper and lower parts into position, you hold the spacer in place, and you can see all the grooves are lined up where they need to be. When you're able to move the whole of the three-part oil control ring around the groove freely, you know you've got it fitted right. Look at that, all moving nicely. There's no tight spots, it's all moving. Now this is a second ring, and you can probably make out here, maybe if I zoom in, it's marked to show top. Here you can see the second ring is gapped and fitted to the piston. When it gets compressed and is in the engine as it should be, the gap will be in line with the mark I made on top of the engine earlier. All of the rings are now fitted. You can see that we've got the gap there for the top ring roughly in line with where we want it to be. This is where each ring will be when the piston goes into the engine. This piston is now correctly gapped. It's bagged up to keep it clean, and we can put it to one side ready to install in the engine later.
Piston rings come in many different styles, but they will always be packaged so that you know which ring is which. The top and second ring in this set both have top marked on them to show which way up they should be fitted into the piston groove, but they have very different finishes and profiles. The top one is finished in silver, the second ring is black. People will have different preferences for style or manufacturer of rings, but we have never found a problem with any that we have used. Here you can see the rings fitted to the piston, and the differences in the finish are clear to see. Everything must be spotlessly clean and ready to be reassembled. Once the rings are correctly gapped, each piston is bagged separately and numbered. The camshaft is coated in assembly lube or LM grease, oiled and installed. The camshaft is secured by 2 bolts on the end thrust plate. Here the new main bearings are in the block, they're lubricated and the crankshaft is resting on top. Half-moon thrust washers sit either side of the central main bearing. The white metal grooved side sits towards the crankshaft. These thrust washers are available in a variety of sizes, and they are the reason why you must never have your foot depressed on the clutch when you start an Alpine, because you will wear these washers out.
The other half of each main bearing shell is fitted into each main bearing cap.
Fit each main bearing cap and spin the engine afterwards. The final torque is 55 foot-pounds. Seal the sides and ends of the outside main bearing caps, keeping the machined faces clean. Ensure that the engine front face is vertically true before torquing up the front main bearing cap. Turn the crankshaft frequently to ensure that it is spinning freely. Align the gaps as per this diagram. Well, here we have the piston ring compressor on the piston. Tighten it up to get the rings pushed back into their grooves. The rings are fully compressed into where they should be, and they're all in their right respective positions, ready to go into the engine. I've moved the crankshaft so that the big end journal is right at the bottom, as far away from the big end as possible. I've oiled the bore with running in oil, and I will gently tap the top of the piston with a very soft piece of wood just to move the piston out of the spring compressor and into the bore. Piston number 1 is now in position with all the rings in place with the gaps exactly where I want them to be. Now I'm going to turn the crankshaft round so that it engages with the big end, and then I'm going to fit the big end cap. New big end shells were fitted that match the regrind of the crankshaft. The new shells will arrive covered in a waxy oil substance. Wash this off with alcohol. The shells must go in with the backs bone dry and the bearing faces lubricated with assembly lube. Here you can see a piston from a 1725 engine, and in the big end you can see the replaceable bearing shells. Various oversizes are available depending on how much you have to have the big ends on the crankshaft ground. This is piston number 2. You can see it was marked before it was taken out of the engine. It is good practice to fit new conrod bolts and nuts. Piston number 1 is now in place and the big end cap is on. The threads have been cleaned
I'll put some stud lock on these threads, put the nuts on and torque them up to 24 foot-pounds. Now we spin the engine to check that everything is still turning freely. After this we will fit pistons 2, 3 and 4, spinning the engine after each one is added to make sure everything's working correctly. All of the big end caps are now fitted. The 1725 engine will be looking like this at this stage. With the engine the right way up now, you can still see some of the felt pen marks on the top of the pistons, showing where I wanted my ring gaps to be when I installed the pistons into the balls.
Ensure that the one-way valve on the timing chain oiler is springing correctly and sealing the oil pipe hole.
To fit this, you have to separate the two parts to do up the back nut and then put the olive and the brass nut into position. It's really important you don't lose the little tiny ball that is in there. It's on a spring. You have to make sure that this nut goes into the engine, that the little ball is there, the spring is behind it, and then you fit the brass piece and the little pipe. Take a lot of care with this, you can't afford to lose anything. Here you can see the pipe is in the correct position. Now we will fit a new gasket to the engine mounting plate, put some gasket sealant either side of it and fit the mounting plate to the engine. Here is the mounting plate and new gasket. Initially I've just got the engine mounting plate holding in position with the pillar bolt here that takes the central timing cover bolt. Now I can make small adjustments with it here, line the holes up, make sure the gasket's right. That's what I'm going to do now, and then I'll let the gasket cement set. The mounting plate has now been in position for a little while, long enough for the gasket cement to go off, and it's all sealed nicely. So we're going to look at putting the timing wheels on. Here you can see the two timing wheels loosely fitted onto their respective shafts. Now we're going to take them off again, put the chain on and get the wheels back into the same position. Here we have both timing wheels fitted onto their shafts. You can see the two white marks are lined up here, and the chain is loosely in position. Well, it's in position, but it'll go tight when the chain tensioner is put on. At this point, although number 4 and number 1 are both at top dead centre, it's cylinder number 4 that is on the firing stroke. So we need to rotate the engine forward in a minute, 360 degrees, one complete turn, to bring number 1 to the firing stroke. Not all of the workshop manuals include this step, but it's very important for when you come to time the engine. These 3 pieces lock the camshaft wheel to the end of the camshaft. The 3 pieces will go on like this. The D plate will go on here. The locking tab washer threads into the camshaft groove and there, and then when the bolt's applied and put in there, once that's all locked up tight, the back edge here is turned up to lock that bolt and stop it coming loose. Well, to make that a little bit easier, I tend to start to bend these now in a vise before I put them into position. You can probably see here, I've bent the locking tab washer up a little bit, just to make it easier to bend over once it's in position. Now I'll put the D washer in place and then fit this into position. It is now necessary to rotate the engine 360 degrees forward so that number 1 and number 4 come back to the position of top dead centre, but number 1 will be on the firing stroke. I've refitted the crankshaft dog and I'm going to turn the engine forward 1 complete revolution. Okay, we're coming up towards top dead centre. And now we're at.
top dead centre. The difference this time is that we are now on number 1 cylinder, having the firing stroke. Now I'm going to remove the crankshaft dog. When the crankshaft has been turned 360 degrees forward, you can see how out of line the timing marks are now. The crankshaft timing mark is still here, roughly the same position. Camshaft is opposite, it's all the way over here. This is a really important step. Do not forget to do this. Now I've turned the engine onto its side. And here you can see that I've marked the smaller section at the top of the oil pump. This is just to make it easier to ensure that it's lined up at the correct angle when I fit it into the gear teeth that are cut into the camshaft. You can see here as I bring the oil pump up into position, it rotates as it engages with the gears. And what you want is it's somewhere between about 47 and 49 degrees in this plane, with the smaller segment at the top. Now that's pretty close what we've got there. That looks like the diagram in the workshop manual, and we should be able to tighten the oil pump up in that position. The oil pump is secured into the bottom of the engine by the 2 bolts here and here, placed by the feed pipe here. That's now in position, correctly timed and ready to go. We can move back to the front of the engine and the timing cover now.
The 1725 engine will be looking like this at this stage.
We've now fitted the timing chain tensioner mount here. We can put the timing chain tensioner and its split pin into position and leave that ready to go. There's not a great deal of wear on this tensioner, so we're going to reuse it. Be careful with these. A lot that are being sold now are pattern, and they have simply fallen apart in the timing chest. If you can get an old original one, then you're probably better off to do that. We now have the timing chain tensioner in place here, locked in place with a new split pin here on the washer. That's all ready to go. The next thing we'll be looking to do is to put the timing chest on. This is where you have a choice. You can either go for an Alpine Innovations style timing chest with an oil seal, or the standard one, which has the oil thrower inside and a scroll in order to throw the oil back into the engine. Here are the 2 options for the timing chest. On this side you have the standard setup with a paper gasket. Relies on the scroll in the balancer to work the oil backwards into the engine, and has an oil thrower disc that sits here between the back of the pulley and the crankshaft. This one is the Alpine Innovations version. This has an oil seal with a lip here. You then add a speedy sleeve to the pulley, make it smooth so there's somewhere for the oil seal lip to run on. And then this comes with a rubber silicone type gasket. We've used these on a number of cars and they stay completely oil tight. There is a special tool available for this job, but you don't really need it. Put 1 layer of electrical tape around the crankshaft pulley. Lubricate the electrical tape. Mark the crankshaft to show the woodruff key position and fit the oil thrower disc. Loosely fit the timing cover and securing bolts. Put the pulley on the crankshaft and move the timing case around until the pulley spins without binding. Then gradually tighten the timing case bolts with the electrical tape still around the pulley. When you remove the electrical tape and refit the pulley, it will be centered.
For years we had a tool that we made from an old box spanner for tightening up the crank dog nuts, but we found that Draper make a long socket, and the 32mm version fits exactly over the dog and is perfect for tightening up. These gaskets can be used over and over again, so what I tend to do is I use gasket cement to glue the gasket to the removable panel, and I do that for the timing chest and the tappet cover, and then I put a thin smear of grease on them just before I put them in place. That way, when you take it off again next time, the silicone rubber gasket will be completely undamaged and able to be used again. Just catch the lip of the tensioner on the inside of the cover as you bring it down into position. It should be more or less in the centre as it goes down. You can feel the spring pushing against to do this. I've got one of the bolts in on the side just to give me a little pivot point. There we go, I've got the centre one. Now, it's less of an issue with the Alpine Innovations timing chest about centralisation, but you still want to get it as near centre as you can. Ideally, you want the end of the crankshaft here coming through dead centre of this oil. So I'm just going to put the other bolts and nuts and bolts in some cases into position, and we'll start to shift this until we get it dead centre. Lock the crankshaft with wood between the block and the heavy web on the crankshaft, and tighten the crank nut. Note that some Alpines have a different style of crank nut dog and use a locking washer to secure it. Fit new cork seals and add sealant at the bearing cap edges and external corners. We also added sealant both sides of the sump gaskets. When the paper and cork gaskets are in place, fit the sump, add the centre bolts first, and gradually tighten the others all round. We also add a magnet to the sump plug, secured by liquid steel. This magnet is intended to catch ferrous swarf in the sump before it goes through the oil pump. Okay, when you open the parcel from New Forest Gaskets, this is what you get. You've got the long side strip seals that look familiar to the paper ones that Roots used originally, but this time they're made of a type of silicone rubber. And whereas Roots used cork for the end cap seals, again, this is the slickerish rubber silicone, I'm not sure what you'd call it, silicone rubber seal. There are two different styles. One is like a T shape, one is like an L shape. They go in the grooves on the main bearing caps at the end. And New Forest gaskets also include a plug tap to clean out the holes in the bottom of the block, and additional studs and washers here to help hold the side strips in place as you fit all this up. You tighten this to a much lower torque than you would normally do. We know that from having used the old set. You really don't need to go crazy when you tighten this up. You will crush the washers that are inside here. They're sunk inside the silicone, and that will ensure that everything is sealed and stays in place. In order to help fit the slickerish gaskets when the engine is still in the car, New Forest gaskets provide 6 studs to screw in place of bolts. This helps to hold the gasket in position when you're working underneath the car. Obviously, it's much easier to be able to do the engine off of the car like this. Now we will choose suitable holes, put the plug tap through those holes to clean them, and then position the studs to hold the gasket nicely in position on each side. Using the plug tap supplied by New Forest gaskets, we carefully clean every hole that either a stud or a bolt is going to go into. When the plug comes out, it brings 50 years worth of dirt and rubbish with it. leaves the threaded hole nice and clean and ready to accept the stud. We lock two nuts together on the stud, apply a bit of thread lock, and then put the stud into the block and release the nuts. Here you can see I've put 3 studs in each side of the engine at the bottom. If you were working underneath the car, that would make it a lot easier to get the gasket to stay in position. That's what the studs are really intended for. New Forest gaskets not only include the nuts for the new studs, they also include lock washers to replace the original lock washers. This type is said to be much more secure for low torque applications, and this is a very low torque application. The sump is back from powder coating and ready to be refitted. On the early sumps with the external dipstick, I paint the top of the dipstick tube white. It makes it a lot easier to find in the dark area down the side of the engine when you go to put the dipstick back in. It's very important that the lips of the side strip go into the recess on each bearing cap. The seals that go in this groove then must be on top of this and hold this down into place. This is the way to ensure you have no leaks. I have very carefully trimmed one end of this, and you can see that when that is tightly sitting there in that corner, the seal goes over to here and will sit on top there. I'm happy that's the right length now to make the seal at that end. Now I'm going to repeat that with the T-seal at the other end. The sump is now resting in place, and you can see the seal just pinching between the bearing cap and the sump there. You can see the side strips under here, and the same at the back. Now we'll fit the other bolts and just very loosely tighten them up now. All the nuts and bolts are now tightened up. I don't have a torque wrench that goes down to the type of settings that they're talking about here, which is very, very low. But I've just done it until I can see the gasket starting to bulge out the sides, and that's enough. It's nowhere near as tight as you would have done the old cork and paper ones. We fitted the back 2 studs to provide a guide to fit the head gasket, and then now we're going to put the cylinder head on and gradually torque the head up in stages. I like to get the head absolutely in line with the block before I tighten it up. That makes the gasket's life easier. Do this at the front, do this at the back, make sure they're both the same. There you go, no gap, absolutely vertical. Fit the 2 studs and 8 cylinder head bolts and torque the cylinder head down in sequence to 45 foot-pounds, not 48 pounds as some of the manuals say. Roots change this setting to reduce head gasket failures through over-tightening. 45 pounds only. Fit the cam followers, make sure they're well lubricated before you put them in. Fit the rocker feed oil pipe. Seal the gasket to the rocker cover. Fit the push rods to the same valve positions that they were removed from. It's important that you put them back where they came from, or you will suffer from premature wear. Fit the rockers and connect the rocker feed pipe. Torque the rocker pedestal nuts to 11 foot-pounds and approximately gap the tappets to 12 thou inlet and 14 thou exhaust. These will be redone once the engine is hot. Turn the engine over on the starting hand to ensure that all is working correctly. Seal the gasket to the tappet chest cover. Note that you can now get silicone rubber seals for both the tappet chest and the rocker cover.
If you've moved things about at the front of the engine as we have, it's a good idea to get a straight edge and measure the pulleys and make sure that they are actually in line, because you can move the water pump pulley, you can reposition the alternator. Both of these can be done easily, but you really don't want your fan belt squeaking because things are not in line. It's quite simple to check and quite easy to adjust. The one that's hard to adjust is the main harmonic balancer here at the bottom. Worth checking. Now you need to prepare to fit the engine into the car. If it's a manual car, it will have a spigot bearing, either a phosphor bronze one or a roller bearing. The gearbox main shaft rides in this. If it's worn or rough, change it. To remove it from the end of the crankshaft, fill it with grease and drive a close-fitting piece of bar into it. The grease will push the bearing out. A manual car will have either a carbon or roller clutch release bearing. The clutch mounts onto the flywheel. The plate must be centralised. You can make a centralising tool by wrapping insulating tape around a piece of bar or socket extension that fits into the spigot bearing until it just fits through the centre of the clutch plate. We find with manual cars that it's possible and often easier to connect the engine, gearbox and overdrive together and then fit them into the car as one long unit. If you jack up the rear of the car as you do this, it makes doing it even easier. With an automatic car, you need to fit the flex plate. Lock the engine with a bar on the crankshaft pulley and tighten the 4 bolts to 40 foot-pounds. Whether manual or automatic, once you're ready to fit the engine, make sure that the engine bay is protected and ready to accept the engine. Obviously, it's easier to fit an engine into an empty engine bay, but that is often not possible, and you need to manoeuvre the engine around obstacles such as the brake servo. We use pieces of cardboard to protect vulnerable parts of the car. Once your engine and engine bay are ready, lift the engine and lower it into the bay. Engage the gearbox shaft in the spigot bearing if it's a manual car, or align the flex plate with the torque converter if it's an automatic. Insert the dowel bolt on the left-hand side and the other connecting bolts at the top to join the engine to the gearbox. Keep the engine suspended from the crane. This allows you to loosely fit the engine mount bolts and move the engine slightly. Use the starter handle to ensure that the engine is in the centre of the bay and slowly lower the crane as you tighten the bolts. We fitted the engine stays earlier to apply pressure on the sump gasket. Now you need to remove them, fit the cover plates to the bell housing, and then secure them using the bolts in the engine stays. Remove the engine crane and secure the remaining bolts. Remember to fit earthing straps around the engine mount rubbers. On all of our cars we have high gear starter motors. As well as spinning the engine very quickly, these work on the opposite side of the ring gear to a standard starter, so it's like getting new ring gear as well, because it's working on an unworn part of the ring. Here we've refitted the alternator. Note the silver heat shield material wrapped around the wires to protect them from the heat of the exhaust. With a new gasket, the oil filter takeoff is fitted. On a Series 5 there's an additional block here that feeds the oil cooler. Oil the threads and rubber seal of the oil filter and fit it to the takeoff block. Fill the engine with running in oil, either 1540 or straight 30. Don't use normal engine oil when you're running in. The quality can be too high and cause the engine not to run in correctly. You just end up with glazed bores and a lower compression. This car has a filter magnet, which is a very good idea as it holds any microscopic particles of ferrous metal in the oil filter. If you're lucky enough to have an original style two-piece gasket, it's important that you fit it in the correct way. The fibre section goes against the cylinder head, and the steel slipper gasket has to fit between the fibre gasket and the exhaust manifold. It has to have the raised sections pointing outwards towards the manifold. Use exhaust paste on the bottom ends of the exhaust manifold to ensure a tight seal at the join, and fit the exhaust manifolds to the head. There's not a lot of ground clearance on an Alpine, so we always point the ends of the U-clamps upwards. On a manual car, you need to connect the slave cylinder to the lever arm and fit the rubber boot. Make sure you fit the slave cylinder the correct side of the bell housing. It needs to be towards the back of the car. The bleed nipple on the slave cylinder needs to be at the top. Fit the water pump, thermostat housing and bypass hose. Note how on this car it has aluminium plates shutting off the horn openings. This is an excellent modification developed by Tiger Tom and Chuck King in America. They found that at slow speed, hot air gets recirculated through the horn openings. If you block them up, you will only have ambient temperature air being drawn through your radiator. It's a good modification. The aluminium plates are held on by the top radiator bolt on each side. Being an automatic, this car has additional linkages under the carburettor to work the kickdown mechanism. Connect the battery and set the static timing to 11 degrees before top dead center. This should be enough to get the engine running. Mix blue antifreeze and deionized water in either a 50-50 or 30-70 ratio. Fill the cooling system. Do not use red or oat antifreeze. It will damage this type of engine. With the electrics connected and power to the coil, put the spark plugs on the cylinder head, turn the engine over and check for sparks. Check for fuel in the carburettor. Now remove the supply wire to the coil. Still with the spark plugs out, turn the engine over in short bursts until oil pressure is showing on the gauge. This may take a couple of minutes, but keep doing it. Do not skimp on this step. You do not want the engine to fire up before there is a sufficient cushion of oil at the big ends and main bearings. Check everything is correct, coolants and oil are in place, wires are connected, and refit the spark plugs. Connect the supply wire to the coil, and if you're ready to try and start her up, turn her over. Remember, you must never depress the clutch when starting an Alpine. Get the engine fully hot, then set the tappets to 12 thou inlet and 14 thou exhaust. Now test drive the car. Don't let it labour and don't drive it too hard while running in, but do make repeated bursts of light acceleration. This forces the top piston rings out and into the cylinder walls, which helps with the running in process. After the car has been run and is fully hot, leave it to cool, ideally overnight, and then re-torque the cylinder head bolts. Remember, loosen one flat off and then torque back to 45 foot-pounds. After 500 miles, drop out the running in oil and replace with ordinary 2050 and a new oil filter. You can see the microscopic ferrous particles that have been caught by the sump magnet. These would normally pass through the oil pump. Clean the magnets before refitting back into the car. Note how after several hundred miles, the underneath of the engine is totally dry and leak-free. The engine is extremely smooth and very quiet, and as it runs in, it will get smoother and quieter. We do another 500 miles, and then at 1,000 miles, we change the oil and filter again. After this, it's just routine servicing. Every 3,000 miles, change the oil and filter. Enjoy the car. You're watching the Sunbeam Alpine channel. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video, and I hope that it helps you with your rebuild. If you'd like sequential instructions, please feel free to email me at the address shown at the end of this video. Until then, it's goodbye from Oily Puddles Garage and goodbye from the Sunbeam Alpine channel. Goodbye.